Hey there, Improv Tipsters. Welcome back to Improv Tips, where I and some of the best improvisers in the world give you improv tips and advice to make you a better, more confident, and happier improviser wherever you are in your improv journey. I am, as always, your host, Paul Vaillancourt. Let's begin. Today's guest tipper is Corey Rosen. Now, Corey has had a really winding career. He has been a special effects artist. He has been a writer. He performs at Bats in San Francisco. He is a Moth story champion. In fact, he's now the host of the Moth Live Story Slams in San Francisco and Berkeley. And now he has added author to his resume with the publishing of his new book, Your Story Well Told. Your Story Well Told, which is a book about telling stories. How do we tell our stories and how do we tell them better? There's a link, ding, ding, down below how to get that book, so check that out. And when I found out that his book was coming out, I thought he'd be the perfect one as an improviser and a storyteller to come on and talk about how do we make this part of our shows better, right? A lot of times we do this monologue opening, but it's almost like a throwaway. I feel like we don't give it as much concentration or effort as we give other parts of the shows, right? And I feel like every part of the show, from the moment how you walk on stage and the moment how you walk off stage and everything in between, should all be as good as they can be. So I thought he'd be the perfect one to come on and talk about this. And he gave really a great video with 3 different tips about telling stories. One of them is the Invocation. And I did this video, ding, ding, on a deep dive in the Invocation a couple of years ago. So if you like the Invocation, you might want to check that out. Or if he inspires you, you might want to check that out. I'll link it there. But then one of the techniques he talked about in his tip was nesting stories. And I was so interested in that, I asked him to tell me a little bit more about it, and he sent me another video. So now we have bonus content. We have the 3 original tips plus a deeper dive into nested stories. So please stick around for the whole thing. You will not be disappointed. If you're enjoying the improv tips, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and commenting down below with what's your big takeaway from today's lesson. What is your big takeaway from what Corey's suggesting about telling stories? Or do you have a lesson or an exercise or technique that you use yourself or with groups to make those stories better, more interesting, more a part of the show? Let us know down below in the comments. But right now, let's sit back, relax, and enjoy Corey Rosen.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, tipsters. I'm Corey Rosen, and here are 3 tips for telling better improvised stories. 1. Nest stories. One of my favorite formats for storytelling, improvised storytelling, is to give sort of the perception or illusion of a more complex story by nesting one story inside of another story. This is, of course, the format of something like Arabian Nights, where you've got kind of a frame story where you're introducing characters and worlds, and somewhere in that story have a character tell their own story. So by then taking it into that story, now you're dropping in a level, you're going a little bit deeper, and you're telling another narrative that in some way is inspired by or reflecting on what happened outside that. Then when you conclude that story, popping back now to wrapping up the story that you started with. So what you then allow is you allow a story to give meaning to another story. It makes you look brilliant, and it's a super fun way to make a slightly more complex story. 2, bookends. Bookends. If you are ever struggling while telling an improvised story to find an ending, the wisdom of the ages is to look not forward, but to look in reverse. And so the technique I like to do as a storyteller is to bookend, to think about the first thing that I said, the introductory offer or moment that started the story, and then when I am wrapping up my story, as I am heading towards what I'm hoping to be kind of the conclusion of the story, I will reincorporate that very first idea, offer, or sentence into the story and wrap up with that. Whether it's if I can do it, a great way to do it is even in the phrasing, almost like music, where you give a line and that line somehow comes back and you restate that same line. It gives a beautiful symmetry to your storytelling, and it's a really fun way to give a shape to the thing where it feels like we've gone somewhere together and we've kind of ended up with a message or with a purpose statement. The last thing is one of my favorite invocations from Del Close, which is the invocation. The idea of taking a suggestion from the audience of an object and invoking it, giving it sort of the spirit of the god of that object. And the invocation, for those who are not familiar, has 4 parts. First, it is, describing the object. Second, you are, addressing, like in the second person voice, the object as if it is there in front of you and you're speaking to it. Thou art, elevating that object almost on a higher, on a pedestal, on a higher plane, and as the sort of the god of the object. And finally, I am, becoming the object itself and speaking from the voice of that object. It's a great way to discover meaning, find the inner life of an object, and find your way very often, which is what is the power of this exercise, into not just taking a intangible concept, but making it personal, making its world more complex and interesting, and finally becoming that character that is inspired by all of that beauty and poetry that you have found in the description of the object. So those are 3 tips for telling better improvised stories. Thank you very much. So a kind of preface idea is the concept that every story you tell doesn't have to be the big story. Like it doesn't have to be a near-death experience. It doesn't have to be falling in love, finding your soulmate, that kind of thing. The small moments in our lives, the maybe commonplace or normal situations, a typical thing, it might be driving a kid to drop them off at school, might have enough substance and enough context inside of that little moment to indicate a bigger world, indicate bigger things. Just like in a good improv scene, a lot doesn't have to happen in the scene for us to notice that the characters are affected or changed. So by not falsely making the story a big story and sort of imposing meaning and purpose on that, but having it come out of something natural and real, your stories and your storytelling can feel a lot more relatable, honest, and connect with an audience that feels like, wow, a similar thing happened to me, and it's about how you look at your experiences. So when you're telling a true story or an improvised story, a nice technique that I use quite often that I really enjoy is kind of nesting story within a story. And a fun and accessible way of doing that is using time as the factor that jumps between those. So take, for example, your life or a situation that's happening right now. So you're telling a story. For example, I'll use the one that I just set up a second ago, just because it came to mind, is, I'm living in the pandemic like everyone else, and my child, who is a freshman in high school, just started high school in person for the first time last week. So it's his first time actually going to school in a week. So, I mean, in a year. So the story that I tell might be the story of the first morning or the night before going to school. So it might be a story about relating, advising, dealing with the strong emotions that my son is going through this tumultuous moment that he's experiencing, which is excitement and, of course, all the nervousness that you would have starting a new thing, just like it's your first day of school, even though it's March. So as a storyteller, rather than just telling that thing, to relate it back to me, I like to use this technique, which is that I time jump. So I would go back then to my own life, maybe to a time that I was going, my first day of high school, or my first time doing something, so I can relate the experience that my son is having through a story within a story. So jump your character back in time to a relatable or similar experience that you had gone through that would in itself have its own kind of beginning, middle, and end, a little mini story within the story, before then returning back to the frame story and maybe ending the story with dropping him off and seeing him off in a way where I now have the context and the insight of seeing my child going off to school, and also reflecting on my own feelings and my maybe experience as in a different role, my experience as a parent letting go versus the experience that I had within the nested story of being in his shoes. So that's a fun kind of way to liven up your storytelling, mix up your storytelling by adding a little, just a little bit of complexity and interest by using storytelling that is nesting two stories inside of each other.
Hey friends, thanks for checking out the video, and if you want to hear a little bit more, check out one of these two quality videos. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe and follow us on social media. All the links are in the description down below, and let me know what you would like to see an improv tip about. Thanks for watching.